Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Jeremy, for that. You must have not spoken to all my students, but today I'm going to build on Bob's great presentation and really focus on Kansas and Kansas trends. And like Jeremy said, we'll add in some ideas of what perhaps are driving some of these trends. But my aim is to examine new firm creation across Kansas and what's going on with that. And so I'm going to look at that trends overall, and then we're going to try to peel the onion away, so to speak, and look at trends across different segments, different geographic areas, looking at men and women and minorities, as well as across industries to see what's going on. My aim is that this kind of helps drive the discussion further, and we can begin to kind of think about how can we influence this? What can we do to impact firm creation? So just a little background on where I got the data. Jeremy kind of mentioned the NETS database, and this is data that's compiled from Dun & Bradstreet data, and they try to track firms. They interface with state Secretary of State's offices and firm filing. They make over 100 million phone calls to try to follow up to get accurate information about firms and who's leading them, how many employees. And so it's a pretty comprehensive database. I look at that at the county level across Kansas over 20 years, from 1990 to 2012. That's the latest data that is available, and so that is a little bit dated, but I think looking at the past is going to be help us kind of look towards the future and get an idea of some things that we can perhaps do differently. I'm also looking at U.S. Census data, in particular the survey of business owners. This is a survey that the census does every 5 years, and they take IRS data and then they send out surveys, a representative sample of surveys to business owners, and then they, via probabilities, estimate the number of firms and characteristics of those firms. So I'm going to look at those two data sources in Kansas to identify various trends. So let's first look at the data. So overall, the blue line, I don't know if you can see that. The blue line is the number of firms from 1990 to 2012. And the trends on the bottom there, and I'll blow that up so you can see it, is the births or the new firm creation and the deaths each year. So you can see that the net effect is positive. Kansas, similar to the rest of the country, is overall firms are growing. Now, these are all firms, corporations, sole proprietorships, LLCs. So you stop right there, and it looks good. Kansas is getting more firm kind of creation. And I debated maybe just stopping right here in my presentation, because this is probably the most favorable slide I'm going to show today, unfortunately, because that's not the whole story. This is... I could have done smoothed this out a little bit and done a 3-year average, but this is year-to-year births of firms, new firm creation, and deaths, demise of firms. So you see a lot of variability, but the overall trend at the firm level is positive. There's a net positive trend of new firm growth. But when we look at, okay, so what are those? What can we learn about these new firms that are coming to Kansas? What do they look like? And if we start looking at different data, we can start understanding that. One is looking at the sales per firm. Even though the net firms are increasing in Kansas, if you look at the sales per firm, from about 2000 on, you see a pretty steady decline, which suggests that these firms which are being added to our economy are small. Many of them are firms with 0 employees or just a few employees that are earning less than $25,000 a year. So not the high impact firms that a state, a community would want to stimulate economic growth. Similarly, if you look at the number of employees that these firms employ, on average, that number is steadily going down. That these firms are smaller, hiring less people, and in many cases, hiring nobody. And that might be a good measure if they are becoming more productive. But when we look at the sales per employee, you see kind of which is a measure of productivity, you see kind of stagnation over the last 10 years or so, last 15 years, that productivity per employee in Kansas is pretty stable over time, meaning that these employees were not getting a productivity effect with these new firms. Likewise, the data I showed for the last 20 years was a NETS database. This is U.S. Census data, looking at the percentage of firms that have paid employees. And you see as well, over the last, starting in 1997, this data is collected every 5 years, you see a net trend down of firms that actually have employees. So suggesting a lot of the firms that are joining the economy are small, many times zero employee firms. So that's not the entire story. We know in entrepreneurship that the environment, the location of that firm makes a difference. Location studies show really facilitates or constrains the economic behavior that is needed to start a new firm. There's resources in different environments, such as financial data, but also networks and mentors and increased customers in different markets that can stimulate new businesses and startups. That's especially true with geography. So I separated Kansas data by counties into 5 different groups based on government classifications of urban and rural communities. And there's really 5 communities across Kansas. You have the Kansas City metro area, which is metro counties of a large metropolitan area. You have medium metro areas. So the Kansas City metro is Johnson County, Lenexa, and Olathe, Overland Park area. And then you have medium-sized metros, which would be Wichita and Topeka in Kansas would fit that classification. The thing I like about this classification is it doesn't just look at population within a county, it looks at where the county is located in relation to population centers. So the medium metro category also includes Sedgwick County, but it also includes Butler County, Kingman, surrounding counties to Wichita. It also includes Shawnee County, which is Topeka. And then we have small metros, which is metropolitan areas under 100,000 people. And in Kansas, this is Manhattan, Riley County, and Lawrence, Douglas County, and a few surrounding counties that are near those areas. So these are really the universities, Kansas State, KU, communities in Kansas. The other category is micropolitan, and these are counties that have a city that's over 10,000 people but under 50,000 people. So cities like in Ellis County, Hayes and Pittsburgh, McPherson, Dodge City, Ford County, Garden City, and Liberals. These are counties that have a fairly sizable city in it. And then the majority of counties in Kansas, of course, are rural. 69 counties in Kansas do not have a large metropolitan or a small size city over 10,000. And so group those all into kind of a rural category. So I looked at entrepreneurship in each of these clusters, these geographic clusters across Kansas. And this is what I discovered, is if the Kansas City metro, if you look at, and this is overall growth. So I looked at growth in firms, employees, in sales of those firms over this 20-year period, and also population growth in each of these areas. All of the areas kind of experience population growth except rural. We know that rural counties are declining in population overall. Not unexpectedly, Kansas City metro counties that are located near Kansas City are experiencing, with respect to new firms, rapid growth, 120% growth over this 20-year period. And those 120 firms also created 54% employee growth in those counties, 102% firm growth as well. Similar to that, the small metro counties were most like the Kansas City metro. The Lawrence, Douglas County, and Riley County, where Lawrence and Manhattan are located, you see a high percentage of growth in employees and firms and sales, more like the Kansas City metro. Probably an effect of being located in where tier 1 research institutions are located. But then you look at the medium metro, which is Wichita, and that is more similar to more resource-poor areas, such as the micropolitan and the rural areas. We have had 86% new firms, but that's only translated to 10% employee growth over that 20-year period, as well as 44% firm growth. So it seems the medium metros, which is Wichita, is not experiencing the growth that comes from new firms that counties in Kansas City and in Lawrence and Manhattan are happening. And I think we've heard some of that, some of the reasons. We'll talk more about that later. So that's, I think, an interesting finding that perhaps we can talk about as to why that is and what can happen to maybe change that in the future. So other things I want to talk about is looking at entrepreneurship across gender, between males and females. Now, why does this matter? There was a study published by the Kauffman Foundation that looked at women entrepreneurs, and they kind of reported Department of Labor statistics that showed that since 1980, just since the 1980s, women who have entered the workforce have accounted for 11% growth in GDP in the United States. So big boost just with women entering the workforce. But that result is really uneven when you look at entrepreneurship. Women lag overall as the percentage of individuals who are helping create new firms. And that can be a problem in that the creativity and contribution and insights of half, the population are not involved in entrepreneurship. And that could be holding back growth in some ways and limiting growth. Now, and also studies have shown that women have certain characteristics, we could probably talk about this for a long time, but that are superior to men in some ways with respect to entrepreneurship. So there was a study in the UK that looked at women have a more nuanced view of risk than men, in that they tend to take more risk, but they're not foolhardy in going after risk. They recognize risk and can manage it a little better than men. They're also more motivated to be serial entrepreneurs than men, some studies suggest. So the fact that we don't have as much women as entrepreneurs can be a factor in holding back economic growth. So this is a Kauffman report of Kansas, looking at the percentage of men and women who own businesses. And this gap that you see is pretty typical across the United States and the world, really. There's some areas and cities in the U.S. where that gap is a lot closer The Northwest, for example, Portland and Seattle markets have a very narrow gap between men and women entrepreneurs. But this is kind of what it is in Kansas, pretty typical for the U.S. and across other markets. Looking at other factors from the data, the NETS data, this is just the number of women-owned firms and minorities. I'm going to talk about minorities. So the blue line is women-owned firms. The red line at the bottom is the number of minority firms that have been created over the 22-year period from 1990 to 2012. If you look at just the percentage of firms from the total firms, kind of a similar decline using the NETS database for women-owned firms. But the other database that I used, the census report, gave kind of a conflicting picture of that. It showed that women firms were increasing. Again, they use a different approach of measuring that. And so the data on that is a little bit mixed, but using the census data, when we look at what's going on with these women-owned firms, we find that about 87% of these firms owned by women have 0 employees. Okay, so most of these firms are low-growth enterprises owned by women. Lot more of those firms. The blue line is the women-owned firms. The red line is the male. So overwhelmingly, women have new firms with 0 employees. And those firms that do have employees, I forgot to put the title on this. That's just another figure looking at the percentage of firms owned by women. But there was a slide in here that also showed that, no, this slide, I'm sorry, indicates that this is the percentage of women-owned firms that are making $25,000 or less in revenues. So the majority of women firms are earning less than $25,000 a year in revenue. So these firms tend to be not the high-impact firms that we would like. When we look at minority-owned firms over Kansas, you saw kind of the red line in those other graphs that I had. About a little less than 2% of all firms in Kansas are minority-owned. That's a lot less than the overall population. And as we break that out by different ethnicities, Asian, Hispanic, and African American, you see a percent growth. There's minorities, even though they have a small percentage of firms in Kansas, are growing rapidly. You see the biggest growth is with Hispanics, probably aligned with the population growth with that segment. But when we look at firms, those firms that are growing and the percentage of those minority-owned firms with employees, there's a different story. You see a lot less percent growth of firms that are hiring people in some of these minorities, especially with Hispanics. Hispanics are growing rapidly, but they're not growing with firms that are hiring a lot of people. Okay, so want to also look at the data by industry, and this has a lot of different segments, which you probably can't see, but that the line where you have the big growth is services over time. So not unexpectedly, personal and business services, this aligns with home-based businesses, businesses with 0 employees, big growth, low barriers to entry, but high competition and consequently a lot of failure, higher rates of failure in this segment. Meanwhile, you see manufacturing overall over this 20-year period that I'm tracking here is declining overall. Looking at some of that data overall, you see huge growths in services, professional and business services, but low growth in different industry sectors with respect to manufacturing. Manufacturing 1 up there is food manufacturing, food processing. Manufacturing 2 is equipment manufacturers, which is the high growth, high impact kind of firms in Kansas. And so that's kind of a figure that may not be indicative of the type of firms that we want to stimulate over time. Another way to look at this, looking at the sales per firm over time at these different industry groups. The bottom kind of line on that graph is personal and business services. So you see that is kind of similar, tracking the same trend as the rest of Kansas, is that it's declining, that these firms are declining in their sales. They're lower impact firms that are joining the economy. Versus manufacturing, you still see kind of an overall lower trend, but over the last several years, leading from 2009 to 2012, it's increasing, which gives reason for hope. So a couple of thoughts before we kind of move into our discussion is, what can be done about this? How can we increase the mix of firms in Kansas in our community to get more high growth, high quality, high impact firms that are going to create jobs? And this gets really tricky. There's policy, research on different policies is mixed. A lot of states will try to give incentives to relocate firms to try to stimulate entrepreneurship and job growth. But that's a mixed kind of a bag. There's a study by some scholars that looked at California, and during the Schwarzenegger governorship, and when he was governor, he did a lot to try to relocate firms to California, and but the impact of that was negligible. That these firms that relocated to California didn't really grow. It was more the organic firms that expanded and startups that grew. There was a study published by Kaufman that looked at the PEAK program in Kansas, program to expanding firms, program for employment growth in Kansas or something. I can't remember the exact acronym, but what the Kaufman report found was that firms that use these incentives to relocate to Kansas did not grow any higher than existing firms in Kansas. Otherwise, it didn't have its desired effect. So it's tricky. Also, we've talked about taxes, and taxes are a mixed bag. Some studies show that lower taxes have an impact. Most do not. I think lowering taxes need to be in conjunction with other things to achieve the impact. Last year, I was interviewing entrepreneurs, and one of them, who's creating a manufacturing business here in South Central Kansas, said, you know what, I'm not making any sales, so taxes don't make a difference to me, but I'm having to buy a bunch of equipment to start my firm, and yet as an individual, I can't write that off. The laws in Kansas are, for a net operating loss, corporations can write that off, but individuals cannot. So that policy in and of itself was influencing him to consider to move elsewhere to do his business, because he felt like he wasn't getting the support for his firms. And that's the challenge. A lot of policies favor expansion of businesses, but are limiting to startups. The needs of startups who are growing jobs are different than firms that are expanding, and so those need to be identified and addressed to create an environment where some of these high growth firms are happening. Also, are we identifying the right people to be entrepreneurs? That's something we try to do at Wichita State. I'm an entrepreneurship professor. We try to cultivate these entrepreneurs and identify and give them the tools to be successful. But are we doing that across Kansas? How do we identify them early and get them the skills that they need? A lot of my students, they come in wanting to do some of these low growth businesses, a bakery, for example. I'm nothing against new bakeries. Bakeries are good. But these lifestyle businesses that have the potential to grow gradually or not at all are not what are really going to impact the economy. So how can we put more focus on those firms that are really going to grow versus all firms? So it's really, good politics of, hey, we want to increase more firms across the board of Kansas isn't always the best policy when it comes to economic growth. And I think there needs to be more emphasis on trying to foster and facilitate these high growth firms, which, as we can see overall from the data, that's not happening. That the overall firms that are joining Kansas are more of the low growth firms. So I leave that for our discussion tables to see. I'm interested to see what you come up with of ideas based on your experience of how that can be stimulated in Kansas and in particular in Wichita. So thank you.